Buenas tardes. Tengo el gran gusto de presentarles el día de hoy a Anthea Buys, crítica, historiadora del arte y curadora sudafricana, que nos ofrecerá una plática con una visión crítica acerca del acercamiento virtual al arte, motivado por los cambios generados por las diversas acciones para mitigar los impactos del COVID-19. El título de su plática, Usted, el arte y Google, mediación extrema y la popularización de la cultura, no podría ser más atractivo y prometedor. La primera parte del título de la plática hace referencia al proyecto Google Arts and Culture, el cual inició en 2016 y a la fecha permite a mucha gente tener acceso a las obras de más de 1000 museos en 70 países alrededor del mundo y que en tiempos recientes ha vuelto viral las visitas virtuales a los museos. Esta referencia a Google le permite a Anthea acomodar el escenario para presentar uno de los temas centrales y tempranos de su trabajo, que es el papel de la mediación en la experiencia artística. Y ante las medidas de distanciamiento social, nos permitirá también aproximarnos críticamente al renacimiento y explosión del acercamiento a la cultura a través de los medios digitales de acceso masivo. Tempranamente, Anthea buscó introducir mayor rigor al trabajo de curaduría, reactivando el papel de historiador en esta tarea. Y también de enfocar el papel de la mediación para facilitar el acceso a las obras artísticas, a la vida de los artistas mismos y lograr que la gente pueda tener un acceso más fácil a la obra artística en general. Estoy seguro que la plática será de gran interés para todos nosotros y aprenderemos mucho acerca del papel de la mediación en nuestra apreciación de las obras de arte. Espero que la disfruten.
Hi, my name is Anthea Buys, and the title of my presentation is You, Art and Google, Extreme Mediation and the Popularization of Culture. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on an entity which I see as having a significant impact on the popular consumption of culture in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. That is Google Arts and Culture, a platform built on a massive database of the contents of some of the world's most prominent museums. Although Google Arts and Culture is far from the only avenue for engaging with art online at this time, its impact on the general consumption of culture is, I believe, unprecedented. It is also fraught with problems, some of which attend other ways of engaging with culture, and others of which are unique to it. I hope this somewhat contained exploration contributes to a critical framework for engaging with the force of digital mediation in contemporary life. I grew up in South Africa, far away from any European modernist paintings. But I remember long ago studying a reproduction of Edouard Manet's Olympia, 1863, in an art history textbook, in black and white no less, and feeling a kind of vertigo. This work was important. It contained profound ideas, and even if I couldn't relate to it physically, it changed how my 18-year-old self thought about the world. This was one of my first meaningful encounters with art, a black and white reproduction of a work that is embedded in the social context and undiscussed racial politics of Paris in the 1860s. I was ignorant of the richness of cultural productions from my own region, simply because these were not part of the syllabus. They were not included in the textbook from which I learned what art was, and so they were invisible to me. Some years later, I saw Olympia in real life at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. I'd expected to be overwhelmed, to have some kind of transcendental experience, but the prevailing feeling I had was an anxiety that I was not having profound enough an experience. I'd become so accustomed to the importance of art represented in certain kinds of books that I didn't know what to do with the real-life encounter. Looking at the work in physical proximity was overshadowed by the imminence of no longer being able to look at the work in physical proximity. To stop this moment in time, I took a photograph of the painting. I've long since lost that image, but it was, like so much personal photography, a way of telling my future self I was there, I really saw it. Today it is possible to look at a high-definition reproduction of Olympia online on the platform Google Arts and Culture. Revisiting this old flame, I zoom in and examine the cracks on the painting's surface. I note the absence of Olympia's fingernails. I linger on the graded blacks of the cat's fur. I close my laptop for the night, and the next morning, when I open it up, Olympia's cat is still there, stretching. I can simply resume my looking. Olympia has not gone anywhere. I have the luxury of looking at the work on my own terms, and with a proximity, albeit simulated, that would never be possible in the museum itself. Several questions arise from this viewing experience. I find I have to ask myself which of these encounters with the work was most satisfactory, which felt the most like a full experience of seeing the work. And the truthful answer is that I'm not really sure. Intuitively, we're inclined to think that the physical encounter with an artwork is the most real and authentic experience, that seeing the work in mediated formats, like in a textbook or online, is a derivative of the real. Our intuition gives precedence to our bodies as the homes of our information harvesting sense organs. We tend to believe, in the words of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, that the thickness of my body is the sole means I have of going unto the heart of the things, that without direct physical experience we can't acquire legitimate knowledge. This view overlooks the fact that physical encounters with artworks are profoundly mediated by the body, and that every mediating body is different. We can't make generalizations about the reality and authenticity of external phenomena based solely on personal corporeal experience. This is to say nothing of the intellectual contexts that attend physical encounters with artworks. History, place, custom, qualities of time, and identity all modulate and mediate the work of art seen in what we call real life. There are different modalities of seeing artworks and different things at stake in each of these different modalities. This is because an artwork is a plural thing. It is simultaneously a physical object, an intellectual gesture, an expression of culture, and evidence of artistic thought. Physical encounter with an artwork is just one utterance in a knowledge-generating dialogue with the work. Over the last 2 months, the way we consume and otherwise experience art has, for some, changed dramatically. With galleries and museums all around the world closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a significant shift towards engaging with art online and virtually, both through online-only programs designed specifically to respond to this moment and through pre-existing platforms, such as Google Arts and Culture, that have enjoyed a revival. The Biennale of Sydney, for example, was open for 10 days from the 14th to the 24th of March, before it had to close to the public and come up with an online manifestation. Faced with the challenge of drastically accelerated virtualization of its relationship with the public, the Biennale collaborated with Google Arts and Culture to publish an online representation of their exhibitions. The resulting collection of images and slideshows, organized into so-called online exhibits, draws attention to a number of highlights of the Biennale without giving a sense of its curatorial positioning or broader priorities. In contrast, when we visit the Biennale website, we are greeted by a pop-up message acknowledging the First Nations on whose land and waters the exhibition manifests. The website then goes on to lead the visitor through a more comprehensive range of online content offerings, including videos, audio recordings from the exhibition catalogue, podcasts, at-home education kits, and artist-created playlists. Though limited in different ways to the Google Arts and Culture manifestation, this presentation of the Biennale gives a sense of the curatorial and pedagogical framework of the exhibition, perhaps at the expense of representing the artworks. In these two contrasting online translations of a physical event, we can discern some of the many challenges of transitioning between modalities of showing and seeing. As with linguistic translation, the meaning embedded in various syntaxes of presentation mutates and loses its connection to the original. Like the Biennale of Sydney, the art fair Art Basel Hong Kong, having sold booths to over 240 galleries, had to pivot with just over a month's notice to create an online-only fair. This ran from the 20th to the 25th of March 2020 and consisted of a collection of 235 gallery-specific online viewing rooms, visible to the public free of charge. Access to bricks and mortar art fairs is usually charged for. Each viewing room contained a collection of images of artworks displayed in an installation mock-up that, somewhat distractingly, included a wooden bench to give a sense of scale. The imperative to sell was made very clear by the displaying of prices alongside each mock-up. Usually at art fairs, prices are discreetly shared only on request. This unprecedented transparency shouldn't be mistaken for a critical intervention in art world conventions, though. It's merely a side effect of moving closer to an e-commerce model. Necessity aside, there's a certain expediency to existing primarily online. Your overheads are drastically reduced, and resources can be channeled into online content that will far outlive an event. You have a clear sight on visitor numbers and behavior, which satisfies some of the neoliberal demands to which museums and other platforms are subjected. Your digital being, whether you're an organization or an artwork, is articulated by data, which means that it's possible to track and analyze every permutation of your online life. We can catch a glimpse of this data-enriched existence through a very rudimentary exercise, also facilitated by Google, which is the analysis of the performance over time of some relevant phrases used in Google searches. Using the application Google Trends and looking, for example, at the performance of the phrase virtual art over the last year, we see a clear spike around mid to late March 2020. This spike is just as pronounced if we increase our range to the last 5 years. This data traces the eruption of the idea of virtual art in general circulation, or to use a more common term, it shows that virtual art went viral. Interestingly, the virtual art spike coincides with spikes in phrases such as social distancing, isolation, and COVID-19. The search volume is not really comparable. Many more people search for social distancing than for virtual art. But we can conclude from this pattern that virtual art shares some topicality with social distancing, isolation, and COVID-19. Right now, more people than before are curious about how to engage with art other than by physical means. Now, when we look at a phrase related to virtual art, virtual museum tour, we see an even bigger spike. In early to mid-March, a rash of news articles published everywhere from Bored Panda to the New York Times directed readers to an array of so-called virtual museum tours available on Google Arts and Culture. These tours are essentially interactive online publications created from a selection of highlights from the collections of participating museums, not altogether different from a sophisticated slideshow. Let's look, for example, at one of the Rijksmuseum's virtual tours. This one is about Vermeer's painting, The Milkmaid. Now, the platform tries to simulate the experience of being in a room with an artwork through the integration of Street View, a feature native to Google Maps, which enables you to navigate certain museum interiors just as you would click down a street in Google Maps. Here is the Street View exploration of the same painting by Vermeer. In principle, this is a revolutionary idea, but in practice, the Street View integration is rudimentary and delivers a very poor approximation of physical navigation. The limitations become clearer when we look, for example, at the Street View of Manet's Olympia. It's blocked by an insurmountable pillar. A glitch in the stitching together of this particular view makes it impossible to get around the pillar to see the painting in context. This underscores some of the obvious limitations of viewing art virtually. You're beholden to someone else's potentially careless documentation efforts, but also, more nefariously, it points to a handling of the medium in which your freedom to move is curtailed by Google's script. Moments like this remind us that we are not present and we do not have any agency in the scene before us. What we are consuming is mediation. All our experiences of artworks, even physical ones, are mediated, and all mediation can be reduced to the insertion of something: paper, a lens, a screen, flesh, museum protocols, between us and the artwork. The digital mediation of art is unique because we are habituated to thinking of data vehicles, or the digital packaging in which we consume content, as neutral and non-interfering, as clear windows onto reality. It's no coincidence that the metaphor of the window is so intuitively connected to digital objects. When we open an application or a web page on a computer, for instance, the on-screen territory that represents it is called a window. As we use these windows for various digital activities, our labor and our engagement with the information are situated, whether we wish it or not, by their infrastructure. A more appropriate metaphor for these intermediary digital structures is that of a veil, a sheer but not fully transparent sheath between the subject and the world. In the 2001 essay titled A Silkworm of One's Own, Jacques Derrida, writing about the metaphor of the veil, puts the central dilemma succinctly with the following question: who lets what and who lets who be understood? Some digital veils are more visible than others. The street view of Olympia is a particularly thick veil, for instance. But as the available technologies grow in sophistication, more veils will become thinner, even invisible. The digital mediation of art is likely to become more ubiquitous in the future and less obstructive. If this is the case, eventually the sustained engagement with art online will embed in visual culture a practice of seeing that is not comparable to being physically present with an artwork, but that nonetheless counts for many people as a kind of digital phenomenology. We will need to acknowledge that digital, online, and virtual experiences of artworks are legitimate ways of generating knowledge about works in order to be able to develop a critical vocabulary for this kind of experience. Without this critical vocabulary in place, digital mediation can too easily be seen as a solution to deep-seated problems of access to culture, as if those who have been excluded from cultural life in virtue of class or race can be fobbed off with a virtual museum tour. This way of thinking is at the core of a populist discourse of democracy that collapses the dissemination of content and the idea of political empowerment. A number of the recent articles I've come across directing readers to various virtual museum tours suggest that in making museum-related content available online, Google is democratizing culture. What is meant by this, I assume, is that Google is supposedly eliminating the barriers, real or perceived, between ordinary people and cultural content. In other words, Google is making culture more accessible. This messaging comes strategically at a time when several software as a service and other online companies are offering extended free trials of their products, ostensibly in a spirit of benevolence or as expressions of solidarity. We should be disturbed that this passes for democracy when all it is marketing. This confusion of the availability of product with democracy calls to mind the words of John Berger, who in 1972 wrote, "Publicity turns consumption into a substitute for democracy. The choice of what one eats, or wears, or drives, or we could add looks at online, takes the place of significant political choice. Publicity helps to mask and compensate for all that is undemocratic within society." The fact that virtual museum tours are there for me and everybody else to consume masks the systemic inequalities that surround and even constitute both the museum industry and the online attention economy. For instance, the diminishing of women, people of color, First Nations, and non-binary individuals in the world's cultural narrative is underplayed by Google Arts and Culture's representation of museums as entertainment complexes. An overabundance of content and language that positions museums as resources for tourists, meme makers, and the bored writes over the politics in play in every aspect of the life of a museum, from its collection to its cafe. Google is complicit in obscuring a fraught relational terrain that many museums actively repress and many others are unaware of. Systemic prejudices and oversights are distilled and consolidated in Google's hands, and the colonial, racialized, and gendered manipulation not just of objects, but of entire knowledge and classification systems is normalized by the perceived neutrality of Google's encyclopedic reach. In this respect, Google is another gatekeeper of culture, shaping discourse just as museums, curators, collectors, and patrons have for centuries. The difference between Google and a museum, however, is that Google is at your fingertips. Its influence is far wider than that of any museum, no matter how popular. Democracy does not arise from the absolute mediation of everything, nor does it appear in the absence of mediation. For a more democratized field of culture, one has to practice looking beyond the reach of the megacorporation into territory that is more granular, more local, curated at a smaller scale, partisan in its own ways, but also plural in many. What we need is a new syllabus, one that is responsive, user-generated, shifting, both local and international, both dispersed and concentrated, both embodied and ephemeral. We don't need to altogether replace the body with algorithms and data, nor do we need a nostalgic return to the body of the phenomenological subject. I would like to propose that a new syllabus calls for and depends on a functional emergence of a different concept of body that foregrounds embodiment rather than the body. N. Catherine Hales distinguishes the two in a productive way, writing, "In contrast to the body, embodiment is contextual, enmeshed within the specifics of place, time, physiology, and culture, which together compose enactment. Embodiment is the instantiation of information in material. It means that the body and information are not separate forces vying for sovereignty over our subjectivity, but they are inherent in one another. When we undertake this conceptual orientation, which is relevant to even the most popular or viral contexts, we can begin to see mediation as latent embodiment."
Muchísima plática que seguramente nos ha dejado a mí, a todos ustedes, con muchos elementos para una reflexión más profunda sobre el papel que juegan los medios digitales en las más diversas actividades humanas y principalmente en esta época, en nuestro acercamiento a la cultura, a la ciencia, a las diversas actividades que antes estábamos acostumbrados a realizar cara a cara, ¿no?, directamente en los lugares rodeados de gente y que ahora lo tenemos que hacer a la distancia, ¿no? Estamos inaugurando una época de socialización a la distancia y creo que los elementos que nos ha aportado en esta plática Anthea, ¿no?, dejando, por ejemplo, muy clara esta idea de la ventana o el velo con el cual vemos las cosas, en particular las obras de arte, se dan también a través de la tecnología digital, ¿no? Nos deja con las preguntas, algunas hechas ya añejas, con mucha historia, tienen que ver si la experiencia artística que obtenemos a través de los medios digitales, en esta experiencia virtual, eso no es la misma, eso no es más real que la experiencia directa cuando estamos en los museos. ¿Cuál es el papel del contexto, del espacio mismo que nos permite aprender de mejor manera, de manera más profunda, la obra artística? Y si el papel de la tecnología en este entender en su factor mediático de instrumento para transmitir el significado de la obra, transmitir el sentido de la vida plasmada de los artistas en su obra, realmente nos permite tener virtualmente ese acercamiento a la obra artística. Nos podemos preguntar y tratar de contestar de diferentes maneras si es neutral la tecnología o no en este papel de mediación. Si seleccionar las obras a través del voto por las búsquedas en las diferentes máquinas de búsqueda de información, como puede ser Google o cualquier otra, si realmente nos está dando esa capacidad de poder seleccionar, de poder analizar, de poder acercarnos a la obra artística de una manera más personal y como lo menciona Anthea en su plática en varias ocasiones, ver si efectivamente poner a disposición de todos nosotros los contenidos de arte, los contenidos científicos, toda la información que aparece en la red es suficiente para poder popularizar la cultura. Agradecemos mucho su presencia, que hayan estado con nosotros y nuevamente le agradecemos a Anthea su participación. Muchísimas gracias.